Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Beach Talks. And today we got my good buddy Dr. Tom Price. He's worn a lot of hats, but I think his favorite hat is doctor. And his mama said, what did your mama say if about being called doctor?
When I got in the House of Representatives, somebody asked me, do you want me to call you congressman or do you want me to call you doctor? And I told that story to my mom. She said, you make sure they call you doctor. It took you longer to get that than going to Congress.
I love it. And he's telling the truth about that. So anyway, Tom's great to come and talk to us a little bit today. He's had a fantastic career. He's done a lot of cool stuff. You know, he's done all the doctor stuff. He's done a lot of politics. And so we're going to talk a little bit about both of those. But, you know, Tom, we like to start off with a story, something that's sort of a life story for you. You got me a good story you can tell me?
Well, I got a bunch. I'm not sure which one to share with you. But I guess I got asked a lot why I went into medicine. What interested you in medicine? And my dad and my granddad were docs. So when I think back about why I thought medicine was a good idea, the first memory that I have about what medicine was with my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was born in 1877.
Wow.
He lived to be 98 years old, died in 1975, practiced medicine until he was 94 years old.
Man.
I knew him well. And some of my first memories of him were when he was still working, still practicing medicine. And we didn't live too far from him, and I would visit him on the weekends. We would visit him on the weekends. And one of my favorite things to do was to go with him on Saturday morning on rounds to see his patients. And for folks who know what that means, that you in this day and age, it means going to the hospital,
right,
and seeing the patients that are in the hospital, rounding to see your patients and see how they're doing, seeing who's ready to go home. Well, this was in the early 60s, and so rounding then for my grandfather, who did everything, meant getting in your car and going to people's homes. And so my first memory of what it meant to be a doctor was getting in my grandfather's car and going to visit people at their homes. And I didn't want to do it because I wanted to see the patient. I wanted to do it because I wanted to be with my granddad.
Right.
And so my memory, my childhood memory of that is pulling up at people's houses, and we'd get out. And I remember thinking in my mind, what are we doing here? Why are we stopping here? And in my childhood memory, inevitably, we'd walk up to the door, and my grandfather would knock on the door, and somebody would come to the door. And instead of saying, who are you and what do you want? Again, my childhood memory is that they'd fling open the door, they'd give him a big hug, and they'd say, oh, Dr. Price, thanks so much for coming. Come on in. And I know that somewhere in my heart and in my mind, that instilled in me this incredible relationship that docs have with their patients.
Wow.
That the love and compassion and sincerity and warmth that exists in an ideal situation between docs and patients. And so I remember thinking, goodness, you know, if you can get a job where you pull up to people's houses, they come out and give you a hug and invite you in, I said, that's a pretty good job. So
that's a really good job.
That's one of my first memories of what it meant to be a doctor and taking care of patients.
And you know, I have this marketing thing that I do, and I call it visiting. That we don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
I mean that was more of a like you said, a house call or doing the rounds, and they were expecting you. But that warmth of people inviting you in their house,
That's
I mean,
right.
it's almost like it's a lost art.
Yeah.
Did you, when you were in politics, did you feel like that maybe helped you feel better about originally, like knocking on the door and going in? Did that make it easier for you?
I don't know if there was a connection to that, but I enjoyed the personal aspect of politics. I got involved in politics after practicing medicine for a long time, but the one of the things that drew me to it was being able to make that connection to folks, to figure out what it is that they felt was important, and then try to represent them as best I could. And people were really appreciative. My memories are very positive of what we did and what my relationship was with my constituents and the people that I tried to represent as best I could, both in the state Senate and in Congress.
So I remember as a kid thinking about, since we both had dads that were doctors,
Yeah.
I remember knowing early on that I wasn't smart enough to be a doctor. I don't know what about it was, but I mean, school just wasn't my thing. But when did you start feeling like, hey, I'm smart enough, I think I can go to med school? Did you ever question it, or did you always just feel like you were there?
I was really blessed. I was fortunate. School came easily to me, and especially the sciences and math. I wanted to be a baseball player. I was convinced that I was going to be the next shortstop in professional baseball, and I loved baseball. And I practiced. Oh my goodness! I actually went out to Oklahoma to a baseball camp when I was 12 or 13, and a Chandler baseball camp in Oklahoma, and I spent the whole summer, 8 weeks out there playing baseball.
That was a lot back then.
Well, I was convinced I was gonna be a professional ball player.
What position?
Shortstop. And when I realized, or when somebody helped me realize that my talent wasn't going to take me very far, I said, all right, I'll try to go to med school. So,
so that's interesting. All right, so you get into med school, you get out. You grew up in Michigan, right? Right, and then I guess you went to Emory down here. Is that what got you to Atlanta?
Yeah, I did undergrad med school at Michigan, and then did my residency in orthopedic surgery at Emory and at Grady. My mom was born and raised in Virginia, in Roanoke, and so when I was a kid, we would take part of our summer vacation was driving down to Roanoke and picking up my grandmother and heading over to Virginia Beach. And so the halcyon days of my youth during the summer were spent at Virginia Beach. And I remember asking my mom as a kid, why do we live up here in Michigan, that is? I'm one of five. I was the middle of five kids, so I was the only one who had this sense. I tell folks I got all the Southern blood that there was in our family, because I made a decision early on that as soon as I could make my first independent decision, I was going south. And so my first true independent decision was where I would do my residency. And so when I was interviewing for where to do my residency in orthopedics or in surgery at that time, I interviewed from Richmond south. So I interviewed at Richmond and Chapel Hill and Emory and Grady and at Florida at Charity in New Orleans. I went all the way over to Galveston and interviewed. So
you were set on going.
I was ready to come, and my interview, I'll never forget it. My interview for Emory was on December 23rd. It would have been 1978, and I think that's the date. And I drove down, and I think the temperature was like 73 degrees. And I said, "This is it."
You were sure you were in the right spot.
This is where I'm coming.
It was cold where you're coming from. All right, so talk to me about, you probably got into like a private practice at first, or a little bit, or small, and then all that's changed, right? Yeah. So is that a good change, or is that a bad change? I mean, from a doctor standpoint?
I think, the private practice of medicine, when I graduated from medical school in 1979, they've been asking medical students for decades all sorts of questions. These people that study medical students, right. Your dad may have been one of them,
right?
And one of the questions that they ask is, what, as a medical student, what do you see as your ideal working situation? And in 1978, 1979, when I came out, about 2/3, almost 3/4 of folks said that they wanted to be in a private practice. They want to run their own practice, want to be in a private practice of medicine. And that's completely flipped now. It's about only 25% to 30% who say that they want to be in private practice. Most folks now say that they want to be an employed physician. They want to work for either in an academic setting, or for a large practice, multi-specialty practice, or a large practice, or a large health system. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be in charge of what they do. They don't necessarily want to be captain of the ship, as we used to be told. When I was in medical school, we were always told, remember, you're the captain of the ship. You're the one that has to make those decisions. And it was especially true in surgery. Somebody had to be in charge, and the way that we were taught was that you are going to be that person that's going to be in charge. And so you have a different mindset about what it means to study, what it means to learn, what it means that what you got to learn. If you're truly responsible for that individual who's put their life literally in your hands, you've got to know some things that the person who's all important, the whole team's important,
Right.
but the person bringing in the instruments doesn't have to make the decision about what it is that we're going to do to save or help that person who's lying in front of you.
So does an average doctor, given inflation and all that, are these doctors that are working for these groups, are they making more or less than maybe they would have been? Huh?
It depends. Depends on what your specialty is. Physicians, by and large, for years and years, have been relatively well compensated. That's changing a lot. You've got many of the pressures financially for docs are increasing, whether it's compliance with the regulatory scheme that's here, either at the federal level or the state level, whether it's the cost of just being in practice, the cost of complying with different sorts of things. So it's changing. It's one of the reasons that many physicians now say, I want to take care of people. That's my passion, is to care for people. But I don't want to have to make all these other decisions. I don't want to have to decide, who the office manager is going to be, who's going to be running the X-ray machine, who's going to be working in the surgery center, who's going to, all those things. I don't want to have to decide. Just let me please just take care of
Why
patients.
is that? Why such a change from when you started?
Part of it is cultural, I suspect, but it's gotten much more difficult not just in medicine but across the board. To try to have a practice, try to run a practice. It's so complicated now with the requirements and the complexities of the system itself. It's actually one of the things that drove me into the political arena, is because I felt that at some point I recognized, when I worked here in the North Atlanta area, and I had an office that I started. I was in solo practice for 6 years and then grew it into a large orthopedic practice. And I remember in the early to mid 90s, I remember the day when I was walking from my office. I got the call from the nurse that there was a patient I was supposed to see. I was walking from my office where I do my clerical stuff toward the clinical area, toward the front office where the patients were. And I remember that coming to that door where I would move through that door into the clinical area where you see patients and take care of them. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, there are more people on this side of the door, the non-clinical side of the door, than there were on the clinical side of the door, because there were all the folks back there who were trying to deal with the insurance companies, with the hospitals, with the labs, trying to make certain that everything was being done. And I remember thinking, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, that there are more people who are in the practice of medicine, helping this practice of medicine, who never see a patient.
There's more government involvement, like
more,
a lot
more
of
involvement,
stuff.
more insurance requirements and the like. So I remember thinking, boy, oh boy, when I got the opportunity to run for the state senate here in North Fulton, I remember thinking, maybe I can do more to help patients, the practice of medicine and patients, as a legislator than and to help more people than I could as a physician, because I loved practicing medicine. Oh my goodness gracious, what a
Satisfying.
What an incredible honor it was, and to be able to truly help people. And as an orthopedic surgeon, which I think is the best specialty for sure, because you by and large you're taking care of healthy people who have some calamity befall them. Either they break a bone, or they have some trauma or something. And if and when you do the right thing, most folks get well and get back to what they're doing. Not everybody, and some people have some awful diseases that we had to take care of, and try to help folks through that. But by and large, if you did the right thing,
had a happy ending,
ending, and that was incredibly gratifying. I still get folks come up to me in the post office and the grocery store and the like, who say, thank you.
You fixed this.
You fixed this. You took care of my son. You took care of my daughter.
And that's really what it's all about.
It is. It really is. I mean, there's nothing more gratifying and more satisfying and more fulfilling caring for somebody and helping them.
So let's talk about that healthcare thing. I mean, everybody's got a different view of what the problem is. What is there, in your opinion, what needs to happen? I mean, do we need this universal type healthcare? Do we need more private? I mean, you've spent a lot of time on that. So
I have. You got, how much time you got?
I got all day. give me the quarter's worth, you know.
You know, President Eisenhower, when
we're going way back now.
We're going way back. All the hats that he wore, right?
Right.
And, you know, he was, and he used to say, whenever he had a problem that he couldn't solve, he made the problem bigger, and the solution tended to come into focus if you make the problem so big. And so I used to think about that as it related to medicine, and people get down in the weeds on healthcare all the time, and
everybody's got a piece of the pie, right?
Everybody's got a piece of the pie. But I believe that if you make the problem bigger, if you try to figure out what the fundamental solution is, what's the fundamental fix to healthcare, I think it becomes pretty doggone simple. So you mentioned universal healthcare. Do we need universal healthcare? Well, I mean, that connotes a lot of things. Do we need everybody to be covered? To have some type of insurance coverage? You bet. The system doesn't work anymore when you've got all sorts of people out here, many people out here walking around without any coverage. It just doesn't work. When my dad and my granddad practiced medicine, I remember my grandfather getting paid in cords of wood and chickens.
You just got it any way you could, right?
And
you were going to help them regardless.
Exactly. But the people wanted to compensate their physician for taking care of them, and sometimes they had the money, sometimes they didn't, and when they didn't have the money, then they came up with something that what they thought was valuable enough to be able to give.
Right.
That's you can't do that anymore. It's illegal to do that. So you can't have folks out here walking around without any insurance. So when you make the problem big enough, you got to get everybody covered. Now the question is, how do you get everybody covered? And that's where part of the rub comes. But I think there's a relatively simple way to do it. You have a whole system of like we do, different insurance policies that people have available to them. For those folks that can't afford it, then we make certain that they have something available to them. Our Medicaid system is one of the things that's right now. And you just make it so that everybody is able to have access to that coverage. So that's one principle. Second is, regardless of who's paying the bill for that coverage, the patient needs to own the coverage. They need to be the ones that own the policy. So they're the ones that select the policy. It's not somebody else picking the policy.
Yeah.
And the reason that that's important, that's incredibly important, is that if your doctor wants you to have a test or something, and the insurance company says no right now, you know, you don't need that, or
right.
It's too soon.
Right.
And your doctor's hands are tied. He or she really can't do anything because the insurance company says no. Well, that's not the doctor practicing medicine. That's the insurance company practicing medicine. So your doctor says to you, well, if you can get your insurance company to approve this, then we'll go ahead. And sometimes it's little stuff, a blood test. Sometimes it's big stuff. Sometimes it's major surgery that can help you. So you go home. You say, I got a bright idea. I'm going to go home. I'm going to call the insurance company, and I'm going to tell them that my doctor says I need to have this done. They've already done that, by the way, and they've been turned down. But I'm going to do it myself because I'm the patient, right? I ought to be in charge of this. So they go home and call the insurance company, and what's the insurance company say basically?
No.
Why don't you call somebody who cares? Because you don't pay the bill. You aren't the person that's responsible for picking us. It's either your employer or the human resources officer or the government, state government or federal government, is picking the insurance company.
You're not the customer.
You're not the customer. So you see how the relationship changes. If you own it, they have to be responsive to you because they know that the next time
you go to another company.
Go to another company. So if you get everybody covered and make certain that coverage is owned by the patient, I promise you, we turn this system on its head in a positive way, and it then becomes responsive to the patient, which is who it ought to be responsive
So do we have like a tier system then? So you got people at the bottom that aren't paying that are covered, I mean, what do you,
They would own their company.
an illegal immigrant gets hurt on a construction job and goes
Different question.
different. Okay.
That's a question about the legality of individuals being
Okay.
here. If you want to talk about
Somebody who's legal and they don't have insurance.
well, they would have insurance in my
They'd
system.
be covered
They'd be
under
covered.
something.
That's
Okay,
right.
I got you.
And
then
they would own it.
would they pay for it?
If they made a certain amount of money. Now, those are the decisions that the policymakers have to
Okay,
make.
so you got to figure
You
that
got-
out. So some people might get it free. Some people pay
That's
a
right.
little, very little.
That's right.
Okay, and then you got maybe then from there, is it kind of open to individuals to choose the types of policies that they
Absolutely.
want?
Absolutely.
So then we're kind of back to what we kind of had before a little bit,
But-
except the bottom people are being covered now.
I wouldn't call them the bottom people. I'd say everybody gets covered. Everybody gets covered. The model for this, part of the model for this, people say, well, don't other nations do this better than we do? Well, no, not really from a health care standpoint. But Switzerland has, I think, an ideal model for if you're of the belief that the government ought to be providing health coverage, and that is that the government of Switzerland doesn't run any health system. It doesn't run a Medicare program or a Medicaid program. It simply provides the resources through taxes, obviously, but provides the resources for each individual to pick the insurance coverage that they want. So they go, each citizen of Switzerland, they pick what they want. And then you've got that appropriate relationship.
So we could do kind of like we do with Section 8 housing or something like that. In other words, if you can't afford, based on your income, you can only afford X. So if your policy should be $500 a month, then based on your income, you're going to do $3. Maybe some entity makes that difference up for
That's
you.
right.
Something like that. But yet still as an individual, you're choosing which company that you want.
Exactly right.
Okay, so what I don't understand is why don't we have more options in like the state of Georgia on what we can choose? Why is that so?
All of that is policymakers who think that they got a better idea over the
Are those state? Is that like state insurance commissioner? Who's deciding?
Some of it's state, some of it's the state law that allows for the kind of coverage that's available, and then the insurance department is the one that regulates that to make certain that
So like when I was on Obamacare, right now I'm on my wife's policy, but when I was on Obamacare, it seemed like we only had one or two companies. They gave us options.
right, and now that the reason for that is that the federal government compensates companies a specific set amount for that coverage, and the companies look at that and say, well, I
Can't make any
can't
money
do
doing
that.
it.
I can't do that. My margin's not enough to be able to do that. And so you get fewer companies to be able to provide it. That's why you've got to have a system that's opened up and allows individuals to select different kinds of
And
policies.
then why do people think that's not a good idea? What's the
Great question. there are a lot of people in these are public policy questions now. So these are politicians that get elected to office that are making these decisions about what you can have that you have available to you. And there are a lot of folks in that public policy arena, in the state legislature and in Washington, who believe they know better about what you ought to have for you and your family, as opposed to you knowing better about what you and your family need. And that's where the rub comes, but from an ideological standpoint. People say, well, what should the health system look like? I've got a lot of ideas about what I think it ought to look like, but I'll tell you how you figure it out. You put the patient truly in charge, and the system will move in the direction that the patients want it to move, and that's how it ought to look. And the people are pretty bright about what they need. We're not talking about people being turned away. We're not talking about limiting people's access to care. We're saying that the patient ought to be the one that, and the family of that patient ought to be the ones that are making these decisions, not anybody else.
Would that also work like how would that work from an employer standpoint? Because right now they give you an option, right? So would you also, would you think it'd be better for still the person to pick and not the employer to choose?
Did you ever ask yourself why the employer is providing health coverage anyway?
Yeah,
You know why?
a benefit, supposedly.
Yeah, but why did they do that?
I don't know, tell me.
During World War II, wage and price controls were put in place.
Okay.
And there wasn't significant health insurance at that time. And so the employers, in an effort to try to attract employees, because good people, because a lot of the guys were off at war, so they needed to attract employees. They said, we got a bright idea. We'll provide health coverage. We'll provide both. Basically, it was Blue Cross or Blue Shield at that time, because that was the only company that was out there.
Really?
And the federal government had to answer the question, okay, how are you going to treat that benefit? Is that a taxable event or a non-taxable event? Does the individual have to pay taxes on what that's worth, that benefit is worth, or is it a non-taxable event? And they decided that it was a non-taxable event, which means that there was then a tax incentive for employers to provide coverage for their employees. And this whole third-party system, this whole employer-sponsored system, grew out of that decision, public policy decision, about how it ought to be treated from a tax standpoint. So employers, because the guy running the shop down on the corner, he doesn't necessarily want to pick your health coverage if you're working at that shop. That's not his expertise. He wants to run his shop or the grocery store, whatever.
Right.
But because they have a tax incentive for providing coverage, because providing health coverage for them is less expensive to them from a tax standpoint, as opposed to paying you and bumping your salary,
raising your salary and letting you buy.
That's right. So the incentive is to provide that health coverage, and that's all growing up. But then the employer has to make that decision.
So the employer could say, here's some options to choose from,
Correct.
And then they could still pay it and still get the tax incentive.
And that's exactly the system it ought to be. The employer ought to be able to say, we're going to provide this amount of money, this amount of resource for you to be able to purchase whatever you want. And right now you can't do that.
So we have to have some changes on that.
Those are the kind of changes that you need. But the two principles are, you got to get everybody covered, and the patient has to own the policy.
Wow. All right.
Sorry, we got off on that.
I love that, because people don't know that, Tom.
That's right.
They don't have the depth of knowledge about it you do. We only know what we hear and see on television and stuff like that, and that's really cool to learn that from my standpoint. So you're going along in medicine, and then you decide to get into politics. What was the first thing that I remember, like, I got into selling cars as one of my first jobs, and it hit me, and I went, oh my God, they really do lie, What was one of the things that hit you about politics once you got in there that you went, maybe I was a little naive, or I can't believe it's that way? Was there something? It could be good or bad, but
when I was first elected to the state senate in 1996, and I was elected as a Republican and went down to the state senate. And at that time, Republicans were in the minority. There are 56 state senators here in Georgia. I think we had 21 or 22. So we lacked 7 or 8 folks to get to a majority. And I remember thinking, and I'm pretty full of myself getting down there. I was one of 2 doctors in the state senate. Don Thomas was the other one. He was elected the same year I was, and before then they hadn't had any doctors in the state senate. And I remember, and I wanted to be helpful and solve problems and the like. And so I don't remember the issues, but I'm early in my first term, I took the well to speak on something in the state senate, and so I spoke and I thought I did a pretty good job. I came back to my desk, and George Hooks, who was an old Democrat from I think Columbus area, or I can't remember where he's from, but a wonderful guy, just an old Southern gentleman. He was great, and he actually stood up and he said to the state senate, "Isn't it great that we've got Dr. Price down here now? He comes and helps us understand this issue, and so we can figure it out. And I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to have Dr. Price in our state senate, and I think we ought to vote for whatever it was." And so I really puffed up then. That was good. And it wasn't a week or 2 later, and I took the well again on some other topic, and it had to do with medicine. I gave this impassioned plea for whatever I thought needed to happen, and I left the well. And then George Hooks, same fellow, came down and said, isn't it awful? Dr. Price comes down here and all he wants to do is what the doctors want him to do. He doesn't give a hoot about anybody. And I remember sitting in my chair thinking, well, this is an interesting place.
That changed quick, didn't it?
The thing about politics that I've tried to tell folks, especially from medicine who are going into politics, is that as a doctor, when I got into the operating room or I came into the emergency room, I knew that everybody in that room wanted the same thing, and that is what is best for that patient. And so we were all pulling in the same direction. We were all trying to do the right thing by that patient. In the world of politics, you know from the get-go that 50% of the folks want you to fall flat on your face, and you're not too sure about the other 50%.
There's a lot of people looking out for themselves, right?
Well, it's human nature. There's a human institution, right?
Yeah.
And so there are all sorts of failings because it's a human institution, and you just try to make it as good as you can. But it's different than anybody would ever believe in the machinations and the true processes of the political arena. After you get elected, getting elected is a completely different experience. But once you get elected and you get into the institution, there's all sorts of institutional knowledge. There are the rules that are written. There are the rules that are unwritten.
Right.
And it's different than anything. Certainly was different than anything I ever did.
All right, so Tom goes to Washington kind of down the road later. Now, here's what I don't understand. So you go to Washington. Let's say you're a rep now, a U.S. representative. You get paid what? What's the rough salary for that? $200,000?
Oh, no. I think we got paid $150,000, $160,000.
But now, what would it be?
It's
Still
probably,
same, $150,000?
No, it's probably closer to $200,000.
Okay, so what?
$180 maybe.
And then you get money. I think I understand. Then you get money to run your office, right?
Yep.
And so that number's pretty good, like $1 million or
Everybody
something.
gets a what they call MRA, members reimbursement allowance or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is to to hire the folks that work for you, and you can
Those are people in D.C. in your D.C. office.
in DC and the district office
And the district office.
to rent the district office, to run that office, whatever it takes,
Right.
the computers and everything else, the lights.
You
and
buy all that yourself,
You got to buy all that yourself.
right? Like setting up any office.
That's right.
And you got to hire employees.
Every office is basically their own little kingdom. It's their own little silo of a business, and if you go over it, it comes out of your pocket. So
So you got to stay within that budget.
Stay within that budget.
So
And it's for transportation. It's for your transportation up and back to DC.
it does include your airfare. That was
Yep.
going to be a question.
It
about
doesn't include your lodging up there.
So you got to get another place, apartment or something.
That's
Do
right.
they have any kind of free lodging if you
No.
wanted it?
But some guys stay in their office, but I didn't.
Really?
Yeah.
Sleep in their office?
That's a bad idea.
Golly. Okay, so you do get to pay for your airfare back and
Yep.
forth. So you don't, but what you don't have to be is you don't actually have to live in your district, right? You can live in, you got to live in a state.
You got to live in the state.
But I think there's two guys here that don't even live in their district
That's probably true.
that represent a district, but they don't actually live in their own
Got to
district.
live in the state.
Just live in the state.
That's the requirements are stipulated by the Constitution. So that's
Okay.
where that comes.
So can you use any of that money for any marketing?
All depends what you mean by marketing.
Okay, so would you use money for? Would you to mail out anything? I guess you could do out information flyers or something.
You can use it for nonpartisan information, policy information that you send to your constituents. You can't use it for political. You can't run your campaign with it.
Okay.
And there are very strict rules about that. And there's a committee, the ethics committee, that looks at whether or not you're doing the right thing. And if you're doing the wrong thing, then they come down on you and make you either repay it or what.
All right. So then let's go to the next thing, because I'm asking this because I don't know and I always wanted to know. So then you run your campaign and you get money into your campaign. If you're running
that money comes by you raising that.
raising the money.
That's
okay.
not the money that you get to run.
Okay. So I go out and I raise money to run for office. If I'm running for a U.S. office, that check has to be, if I write you a check, has to be a personal check.
Has to be a personal check, can't be corporate check, as opposed to at the state
At
level.
the state level, you can write a corporate check.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's pretty cool.
And it can't, and there's a limit in both areas. There's a limit on how
what
much.
you can do, and then that limit changes by, you got an overall limit, and then you got like a prime. You can do the primary, and then I could give you 2,500, and then give you another 2,500 or something.
It's per election. So
Per
the primary is different than the runoff, is different than the general, is different than debt. If you loan yourself money, then you can collect money. You can raise money from folks to retire your debt.
Okay, so if I put 100,000 of my own money in there, once I raise 100, I can write myself a check back.
That's right.
Okay. Now, what happens when you're done with office, or you don't get reelected, and you got money in your campaign budget? What do guys do with that?
They're called zombie accounts,
Zombie.
and because the person is no longer in office. I'm one of those individuals that had a zombie account. I've changed that, but and you can use it for three things. You can use it to pay back the individuals that sent you the money.
So you could reimburse people.
You can use it to contribute under appropriate limits to other people running for office.
So so you could do a president or
That's right.
another senator or whatever. Does it have to be out of your state, or can be anywhere?
It can be anywhere.
Okay.
Or you can donate it to a charitable organization, 501c3 or C4. So those are the three things that you can do with it. And again, they're pretty strict on that as well.
What do most people do with that?
Most people don't have a lot of money because they
smoked it up trying to get
raised.
elected.
That's right. The reason my money was available is because then I went to the cabinet and I had just finished an election in 16 and had raised a bunch of money for that election, and there was money left over from that so that I could run again in 2018.
Well, if you're unopposed, a lot of times you're going to have a little
That's
more
right.
money, especially the longer you stay, right?
That's right.
So does that make it harder to beat somebody that's been in there for a while?
Sure does.
Because they can continue to build up that war chest, so to speak.
War chest of resources, but also war chest of goodwill in their district if they're doing the right thing.
Mm.
So, I mean, if you're an incumbent running, then the likelihood is that if you've done your job, you've helped people in your district, and so people get to know you,
Right.
and they say, yeah, he's doing a pretty good job. She's doing a pretty good job. I'll vote for her.
So you're in D.C. and you got two places now. How do people, what's the average person, how do they handle that from the standpoint of, I think it's one thing if you're up there and your kids are gone and maybe your wife's there with you, and you are in a position with your job to where that's your full-time job. How do those people do that also have a job or have a business? Do they go back and forth an awful lot, or do they, you know what I'm saying? Are there people that stay there more full-time and some people are real part-time?
Yeah, it's a little different in the House than the Senate. The Senate folks tend to come for a longer period of time when they come to D.C. The House, most everybody goes home every weekend.
Really?
And the reason for that is that you're running for
You're constantly running
every
right?
2 years, as opposed to a senator who's elected for 6 years. So when you're in cycle, and for members of the House, you're in cycle all the time. Then it's important to be home. Then there are all sorts of things to do when you come back to your district back home, right? You got people that want to see you, they want to meet you, they want you to speak to their group. You got parades, you got political activity, you got all sorts of things that you need to do in order to be able to fulfill the responsibilities of your role. So I came back every weekend. I never spent a weekend in D.C. in the 12 plus years that I was there that we weren't in session.
Wow.
So I went up and back. When the Republicans took over in '94, Newt became Speaker, and he instituted what he called a family-friendly Congress. Because before then, people stayed for a longer period of time. Many of the people moved their families to D.C. and they would go back home infrequently. But with improving airfare and air carriers and all of that sort of thing, there was pressure on folks to go home. And Newt thought that, and the Republicans at that time thought, it was important to have a family-friendly Congress, which to them meant you got to be able to go home.
Yeah.
You ought not be having to move your family to D.C. because you ought to know your district and represent your district. And so he set in place a very regimented schedule of being up there 3 to 4 days a week when you were in session. So you'd come in on a Monday midday, and you'd be able to go home on Thursday, so you'd be able to, or you'd come in on a Tuesday and be able to go home Friday. And that made it so that you could be with your family more and not have to move them to DC.
Well, I often wonder, I think it's part of the problem up there is people are there all the time, and it seems like it's in session a lot. Seems like if I was the king, I'd want it to be like, Georgia, hey boys, we're going to go up here for 3 months, and we're going to do all the voting we're going to do, and then we're going to go back home.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's better. That's a better idea.
But
that
ain't the way it works.
That ain't the way it works. That ain't the way it works. But not being having a finite period of time, I would strongly support.
So, Dr. Price, what's your take on COVID?
Historians are going to be it's going to be interesting what they say about how we responded to this. COVID, it is indeed a novel disease. We've never seen a corona. It's not a novel virus. Maybe the coronavirus is a known virus, been known for a long time. It's the kind of virus that causes a lot of the common cold. So it's a kind of virus that we know. But this virus, the COVID-19, is a new virus. It works in a way that is new and is a new disease. So. And we knew that from the beginning. It was known that this was a new disease. So we didn't know what it was going to do. We didn't know how sick it was going to make people. We didn't know how to treat it necessarily. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that we did early on, as you'll recall, seemed to make people worse. Mm-hmm. We didn't have the kind of vaccinations for it from the beginning, like we do, now for many viral diseases. So. It was a real challenge at the beginning because it was a new disease. There's a lot that we didn't know. So people responded in a way, some out of knowledge and some out of fear,
right?
About with what ought to be done. So the country, the world, a lot of the world went into a lockdown. Well, this is completely foreign to us. I don't know where you were on March 12th or 13th of 2020, but when they say stop doing whatever it is you're doing and you can't do it, whatever it is you're doing,
right?
Unless you're an essential worker, and the definition of that was pretty small, as you recall, because it didn't include teachers, right?
Right.
Didn't include school system, didn't include a lot that we would normally consider essential workers. So that decision was made, and I cut people a lot of slack on making that decision at the beginning because we truly didn't know.
We didn't know.
And it looked like people were dying in droves. And so if you have a new virus, you don't know how to treat it, people are dying from it. They're not just getting sick and
right.
recovering, they're dying from it. Then you got to do something. The problem that I think occurred is that we stuck with that even after we needed to. So we developed ways to treat it to a much better degree. The vaccines were developed at the Operation Warp Speed was incredibly successful. Never in the history of mankind has this ever occurred, where you developed a vaccination, a way to decrease not necessarily the incidence of the disease, but the severity. So people weren't dying at the rate that they were dying from it, and they weren't getting hospitalized from it to the rate that they were before. So we moved within 8, 9, 10 months to a pretty significantly improved position. The problem is that society didn't move. The policymakers didn't move in a different way and allow things to get back rolling. So we've suffered more from this new disease, this novel disease, than I believe we should have. We're still in the midst of it.
So are you getting your boosters or not?
Absolutely, you bet.
You getting it how often? Every 6 months?
I got the initial 2,
yeah,
and then I got the booster last fall, and then I'll get another one this fall.
So what's different about that particular shot? I mean, it's with this mRNA,
messenger RNA.
So that's a different, something about that's totally different than the flu shot or chicken pox or whatever. Explain that to me in layman's terms. Why is that different?
Most vaccines are what they call cell based. So they take the virus, they infect the cell in a way, and then make it so that it's not infectious, and then use that or a byproduct of that to inject into you, so your body says, oh, I recognize that as being something bad. I'll kill it. Or I'll make antibodies to it. Your body makes the natural antibodies to it. And so when you do get infected, if you get exposed to it, then your body says, oh, I recognize that. That's a bad thing. I got to go kill that. And that does.
Who figured that out?
Isn't that something? It really is something. Yeah, Salk and Saban with polio. And I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, people are geniuses when they do. That's why you got to let them work. You got to let them be.
Okay, so what's different about this?
So this is taking messenger RNA is one of the is a genetic component that all of us have that make all sorts of things like different proteins and different things in your body, and this takes a part of the virus that has that messenger RNA and makes it so that virus then can't, it blocks the virus from getting into the cell with that genetic component as opposed to the cell.
All right, help me figure that out. And
It's a completely different way to do it. Now, the important thing for folks to appreciate is that they've been trying to figure out how to use this messenger RNA positively for a long time, decades, at least 20 years. It's thought
FDA wouldn't let them do it, or what?
Well, scientists hadn't figured it out. I mean, they were working on, and they've been working diligently on this to try. It's been thought that it's one of the solutions to cancer, because if you can figure out how to block the cancer from replicating, this cancer cell from replicating, by using a messenger RNA vaccine or treatment, then hallelujah, thank the good Lord. But they haven't been able to figure that out. But what the reason that this was able to be done so rapidly is because of all the work that's been done in the last 20 years on this technology. A number of companies, Pfizer's one of them, Moderna's another one, that had been working on this, and they said, I think that we might be able to do that. The different thing that Operation Warp Speed did that had never been done before is that it took all sorts of money from the federal government and said, okay, here's the money to be able to do whatever you need to do to come up with this vaccine. And we're going to pay you, we're going to cover those costs whether you
pay stupid money,
whether it works or not. Whether it works or not. We're not if it doesn't work, then you give it your best shot. And what happened is that they believed that it worked. And it went through all sorts of testing. Now the testing was sped up. And so people had a lot of concern about that. They said, the FDA hasn't done their job. Not true, but the FDA hadn't done their job was the accusation. The fact of the matter is that at this point, this is the most tested vaccination in the history of mankind. Billions and billions of people, doses literally, have been given. And so we know more about the consequences of this, the side effects of this, than any vaccine.
So you're not worried about any side effects, evidently.
I think that there are side effects, but I think that the incident, every time with a vaccine, every time with a drug, you got to say, am I better with the drug or without the drug? Everything has a risk. There's no doubt about it. And there's some individuals who likely ought not get it. But that decision, again, surprise, surprise, ought to be between the doctor and the patient, not anybody else.
Right.
The doctor and the patient ought to be making that decision. But yeah, sure, there are risks, absolutely. And I'm blessed to be relatively healthy, and thank the good Lord. And I think the risks for healthy individuals. I'm considered a senior. I don't feel like a senior, but I'm considered a senior.
Do you get the flu shot?
I do, absolutely.
Okay, so it's kind of, I'm thinking a little bit for myself, that's kind of what it's going to be like maybe for a little bit, get my flu shot and my
Now what they're working on is being able to have it be bivalent, so the flu and the COVID shot are together, and they only have to shoot you once. So.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
All right, do you think the state of Georgia's turning purple? What do you think?
Turning purple. I think it is purple. I mean, you can't have a state that had all Republican state elected officials statewide, both United States senators, and the significant majority of the House delegation Republican, and have it then move to closely contested statewide races, even though the Republicans have won all of them to date over the last 20 years, 18 years, and have the 2 United States Senate seats for the state of Georgia flip to the Democrat side and not call it a purple state. Sure, it's a purple state.
Why?
The world of politics is a dynamic world, right? So the pendulum swings.
Do you believe in that? It swings all the time?
Absolutely. And sometimes it does this. I mean, it doesn't swing like a pendulum. It doesn't just do this.
Sometimes it stops.
Sometimes it stops and goes back the other way. But our system is one that responds to the electorate. And so when you get out of line as a politician, when you get out of line as a party, and the people say, that's not what we sent you there to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we want. Then the way that they have it to express themselves in the strongest possible way is through the ballot box. And so they vote and turn folks out. And that's why the middle, the folks who aren't necessarily aligned with one party or the other, are the ones that are by and large making the decision, which is why it's so important.
What percentage is that?
That varies too.
Is that 10, 20% maybe?
I suspect we're in the 30% range now.
They could go either way. Okay, that's a large.
It is
a large piece.
Yeah. Perspectives seem to be catering more to the fringe elements of the left and the right than to the folks that make a majority. I learned early on in my state Senate days when I was in the minority. I was in the minority for 3 terms and in the majority for 1 term. Became the first Republican majority leader in the history of the state in the state Senate in 2002. And I learned early on that being in the minority is okay, but it doesn't allow you to do the kinds of things that you yourself felt your constituents wanted you to do.
Right.
And so the majority is absolutely
big deal.
vital. It's huge in a representative democracy. So it's important that people have the ability to change a majority, and the way that we do that is through the ballot box.
So what about this election and people's? What's your thought on was there hocus pocus going on? Was it a fair election? I mean, what's your feeling on that?
I think at the margins there's always something that could have been done better. But when I look at, I mean, you could feel it as the election was coming up, from my perspective, as a proud and staunch Republican. The other side was running circles around us. They were organizing their folks to a better degree. They were communicating to a better degree. They were utilizing, remember during COVID, they were utilizing the absentee ballots to a better degree.
Way better.
I called some of the folks in the state Republican Party, and I said, we're getting our hat handed to us. This was, you could feel it if you're running those circles and you know what it's supposed to feel like when a victory's coming, because there's a sense about the excitement and the enthusiasm and what's going to happen, and it just didn't feel that way. I was really worried. In fact, I predicted, not that it was what I wanted to happen, but I predicted that we were going to lose both those Senate seats in the runoff, because it didn't feel right. I thought that many of our leaders were sending the wrong message, and the other side
mixed. It wasn't unified.
That's right. The other side was energized and organized. So I think in part they outworked us, and in part we
I
stumbled
think they
back.
do most of the time. Seems like Democrats always seem to outwork the Republicans a little bit more, especially on the ground game.
Okay.
But
That's right.
but do you think there's anything to the absentee ballot thing and the 2,000 mules type philosophy or not?
I think there was harvesting of absentee ballots to mail them. I do believe that. I don't have any hard proof for that, but that's just what I felt was going on. I don't think the machines were a problem. I don't think machines were turning votes. I've got some questions about whether people were bundling, which is legal in some states, which is collecting a lot of absentee ballots and going and turning them
all in.
It's not legal in this state, but I've got some questions about but I don't think that they were illegal votes. I think they were organizing their people in a way that got them to turn out.
I wonder if the money that Zuckerberg gave, which was $350 million,
Something huge,
and got passed down to these nonprofits, did some of that money then go to I guess it went to help get out the boat, so to speak.
Right.
And then was there anybody being paid to go get boats if they weren't there or not? And I guess we don't know.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if some people were paid to vote. That happens
Anyway.
and oftentimes in elections. But if that happened, it was real people. It wasn't fictitious people. There weren't fake people that were voting. And it's important that people understand and appreciate. You got to have faith, some faith in our system, and I still have faith in our system.
Right.
There were tens, 30 or 40 court cases that were brought about contesting what was going on in this election, and not a one of them had the proof.
Mm-mm.
And so you got to ask yourself, if you believe in our system, and I do, and I don't believe that all judges are corrupt, and I don't believe that there's a conspiracy out there that is that competent.
Right.
I just people
Right.
it just doesn't work that way. Then the folks who believe that this was fraudulent, there was fraud, and that it wasn't on the up and up. You got a chance to prove that. It was never ever proven in a court of law, and so you got to step back and question that. The solution is the next election and going out and working harder than they did.
Well, that's really what's going to happen for either party, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, I'm kind of wondering why Kemp hasn't gotten more credit for leaving us open. I mean, DeSantis has gotten a lot of credit now. I felt like they kind of did sort of the same thing. Why do you think he's not getting the national attention, or maybe he doesn't want it?
I don't know. I've long since stopped trying to figure out why the media does what it does, but I think the governor's done a whale of a job.
I do too.
We were the first state to reopen, and he took a lot of heat for that. And were there some consequences for that that may have been adverse? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe those consequences were less than the consequences that would have been in place had we stayed closed. So you won't find me faulting this governor on how he dealt with this pandemic. Nobody knew what was going to happen.
He took some bold steps.
He did indeed, and he ought to be given the credit for that. And I think he, without a doubt, deserves to be reelected.
I know a lot of my friends locally that were even, I would call them more liberal,
Yeah.
are saying I'm voting for Kemp because I got to keep my business
That's
open.
right.
He kept me in business.
That's
so
exactly
that's
right.
pretty good thing.
And when you look at the states that opened and the states that stayed closed for a long period of time, the outcome from a health standpoint is essentially the same. So one would want to say that he did the bad. Some would
More
want to say
people died or
that's
something
right,
like
that's right. And that's just not so. In fact, there are many states that stayed locked down, that closed for a longer period of time, that didn't do as well as we did from a health standpoint.
Who are you pulling for the next election, presidential election?
Oh.
Because I understand everybody's running.
Everybody's running. That's where it ought to
Everybody.
be at this point. So
Right.
we're over 2 years away, right?
Yeah. Well,
You may run. I don't know.
think after November we're going to know more about who's running. But
Yeah. I think there are a lot of good folks out there.
who you like out there?
I like Nikki Haley, former governor of
What's
South
she?
Carolina.
What's she like?
Nikki is a great gal. Folks got to see kind of her tenacity when she was
She's tough.
UN ambassador. Yeah, she's got an incredible personal story. She's first generation American.
Mm-hmm.
She's phenomenal when she relays her story. She's bright. She's conservative. She did a great job in her state. I think it'd be great to have a woman at the head of our ticket. I think she'd be wonderful. So
DeSantis. What do you think?
DeSantis is a good guy. I served in the House with him. He's a good guy. I'm like you. I'm not sure why he's gotten all the credit that he's gotten for doing what he's done down in Florida. Although running Florida ain't easy.
No,
And he's
it's
done
a bigger state.
He's done a whale of a job.
Yeah.
It's not bigger geographically. Did you know that?
No.
Georgia is the largest state by area east of the Mississippi.
No kidding.
Most people don't know that.
I would have
It's a
thought.
little
Florida.
fact that you didn't know that you needed to
Hey,
know.
that's why we got you here, man. Because you're educated and I'm not.
Well, hardly.
All right, so tell me, I'm always interested in how people go as far as they go in life and things they accomplished. I mean, how do you talk to yourself? What do you do like when things aren't going good or you're trying to get something to go your way? I like to tell a story. My friend Tony Phillips that I went to high school with, he taught me you know, he didn't know he was teaching me this, but he was a little guy, and
Yeah.
he went all the way to the World Series,
right.
and he'd say, Beach, my stuff always works out. And I heard him say that over and over and over and over again. That was kind of his tape that he played. Do you talk? How do you talk to yourself? How do you pump yourself? I mean, you're gonna go. You're gonna say, hey, you should pick me, not that guy. I'm running for office. Right. I think I'm better than him. How do you get that going?
Well, if you talk yourself out loud, they find yourself a doctor.
Yeah,
so,
you're good. They like my dad. Yeah, yeah.
So you got to be careful that you don't talk yourself out loud.
How about, can you say it to your wife? Probably not even there.
So I don't know. Most of it is, I guess, is just personal makeup and how you were taught from your parents. My mom was my biggest champion. As I said, I'm one of five, and she, for each and every one of us, there wasn't anything we couldn't do, right? I mean, and she instilled that in us.
She made you believe in yourself.
You can do anything you want.
So do you feel that way? There's pretty much anything I can figure it out. I can make it happen.
Absolutely. Now I'm looking in the
rearview mirror.
Some in the rearview mirror. I'm doing a fair amount of looking through the front windshield. But when I was 20 and 30, there wasn't a thing I couldn't do. Wasn't a thing I couldn't do. And from a health standpoint, from a medical standpoint, when I got into the world of politics, I was certain we were going to win the elections that I ran, and it wasn't because I mean, there are other people saying, "Oh, that's going to be too tough." In fact, there were people who said you ought not run. Right.
Right. You're going to always have that, though, right?
That's right. You're not the chosen person. It's not your time.
Yeah.
All these things.
What did you say to yourself?
I'm an upbeat guy. I'm an optimistic guy.
Yeah.
I like to share an optimistic perspective. I think it's important to provide solutions. Hard work. Nobody would outwork me. Nobody would.
So that's a common theme, right? With a lot of successful people, is I'm going to outwork you, or I'm going to do what I got to do.
And I got that through my dad and through medicine, because we worked hard. I trained at Emory and at Grady, and when we worked at Grady, most of the time as a resident, you were there for 36 hours, and then you got to go home for 12, and then come back and do it again, and I loved it. You know, we used to when we worked in the surgical emergency clinic, we were on for 24 hours and off for 24 hours, on for 24, off for 24. We did that for a month or two, depending on what the rotation was. And we used to say, the only thing bad about that is that you miss half of the cases. Wow. So I wouldn't have traded that for anything. It was the most incredible, positive, wonderful experience that you could have. So cheerful persistence. I used to tell folks, you got to be cheerful.
What's cheerful persistence?
You got to keep at it.
Mm-hmm.
Never give up. Right? You got to because
keep pushing.
Keep pushing. What you're going to do a lot of times isn't going to work. So you got to keep pushing. What is it about Edison? He tried 1,200 ways to invent a light bulb. None of them worked. And somebody said, "Aren't you disappointed?" And he says, "No, I've learned a lot. I've figured out 1,200 ways that it doesn't work." So you just got to keep pushing. Got to keep pushing. And cheerful. You got to be happy about it. You got to be optimistic. You got to be upbeat.
You got to see it as fun and interesting
and be positive. And I credit my faith a lot with that. I mean, the things that I have done, I have no doubt that I was only able to do because of the talents that I was given by the good Lord. And that's important to know that you're not in charge of this.
Mm-hmm.
All. Somebody else is in charge of all this.
Mm-hmm.
You just do your doggone best at whatever it is that you're going to do. Whatever it is.
It's kind of like you got somebody riding on your shoulder, whispering in your ear, you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a great story about John Quincy Adams, who was a president, one of our presidents. He was the only president who served in the House of Representatives after he was president. And
I didn't know that.
I won't get these dates specifically right, but he came back and served in the House of Representatives from like 1847 to 1849, or maybe 1851. And they said, why are you going back to the House of Representatives? You were president of the United States. He says, we haven't abolished slavery yet, so I've got something left to do. And he used to give speech after speech after speech on the floor of the House of Representatives about abolishing slavery and why it was important to do so. He gave so many speeches and irritated his colleagues so much that they made what they called Adams's rules, which made it so that he couldn't give a speech on abolishing slavery, or the time was limited or something.
Right.
And he was asked at one point, "Don't you get discouraged? My goodness gracious, you fought this long. You were president. You fought this long for trying to do something that clearly it isn't going to happen. Don't you get discouraged?" And he said, apocryphally, I mean, he said apparently, and I'm just paraphrasing, but he said basically, duty is ours, results are the Lord's. So you just got to do your duty. Just got to do your duty.
And that was cheerful persistence.
Cheerful persistence. And you never know what's going to happen, because you know what? You know who else was sitting in that chamber from 1847 to 1849 for one term? Abraham Lincoln was a backbencher, and his desk was in the back of that chamber. And I believe that one of the things that encouraged him to do what he did when he finally became president 11, 12 years later was because of the persistence of John Quincy Adams.
Wow.
So you never know. You never know.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you for being here, Tom.
God bless you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for sitting in for another episode of Beach Talks, and please share it with your friends. Ask them to check it out. We'd like for more people to hear what Tom's got to say. I think he's got a great message. So till we see you again, thank you.
Take care.